It's already nearly half the year gone. We've had some fairly turbulent times in the oil markets every week, but let's just focus on last week. I suppose the big story last week were two things. One was the EU finally deciding to pull the trigger on oil embargo, oil blockade on Russia, of some version thereof, and of course OPEC Plus finally moving off the current posture, but having little impact, and oil prices rising after their decision. Let's welcome our once-a-month guest, Mike Muller, head of Vitol Asia. Mike, I welcome your thoughts, week in review, particularly those two developments that I referenced, and anything else that's on your thoughts at the moment.
There's so much on our minds at the moment. So, I mean, one of your articles referred to 100 days of conflict in Ukraine. And of course, Shanghai came out of 61, I think, days worth of lockdown. So that created some interesting scenes and some temporary euphoria about the opening up there. And of course, the OPEC Plus Accord you mentioned, another quick meeting, but this time a surprise, and just keeping people on their toes, I guess. What it amounts to in terms of numbers is an extra 7 million barrels a day in the month of July, and same again in August.
An extra 7 million?
Final, well, yes, 216,000 barrels per day.
Oh, okay. Okay, right. I get you.
Up from the 432 to 648. So that's 216,000 barrels a day multiplied by 31 days is roughly 70 barrels of oil. Which put in those terms is roughly the same amount of oil that we've seen moving, interestingly, from the Arabian Gulf to the Western Hemisphere in some rather interesting moves. But of course, all eyes remain on what's happening with Russian output, and indeed the latest round of EU sanctions, which contained a number of carve-outs. So whilst the resolve was very strong to stop completely all imports of Russian oil into the EU, there were carve-outs for Czechia, for Hungary, and for the littoral states in the Black Sea that successfully made their case that they're still dependent and still in need of doing this. So in some cases, they have a wind down generously. So 10 months in the case of Czechia, for example. And therefore, in the eyes of some, the lobbying that obviously centered on Hungary initially to try and somehow compensate them from the European coffer so that they can fall in line didn't take place. And then, of course, you have a group of people who have always been of the opinion that closing down so much Russian oil is detrimental to the economy, is detrimental in terms of spiraling high oil prices, and that even the US administration doesn't particularly want to see prices get out of control because they've pulled a number of levers already. They've pulled the SPR lever. Of course, there's a little more SPR to go. Europe in particular could release a lot of the one product that's really quite hot right now, diesel. But they're also holding back for that rainy day. And the big debate in Europe is, well, is that rainy day now, or could things get a lot worse? What actually happens with OPEC Plus output, of course, is a different matter. There is a commonly held view that really only the UAE and Saudi have spare capacity, and the debate now focuses on what exactly is that number. What can those two countries produce sustainably? Because nobody really knows. It's subsurface and it's not been tested, other than a couple of surge production high water marks that were set by the Saudis. Too much fanfare, of course, just before COVID struck, and those were in the high 12s. But the smart money is of the view that the Saudi current sustainable production limit is somewhere 11 point something, and that's a pretty wide range. And yes, the quota gets them to 10.8 and then above. And we must remind ourselves most other OPEC Plus members are already at their limit, and therefore this provides an open goal for Saudi and the UAE to make up the shortfall. Notably also, some may recall that there was a month, which I think was March, or maybe, yeah, I believe it was just a few months back, when you may recall the Saudi OSPs went very high because of the formula, and a lot of people felt that that was too much at once, and there was an undernomination. So I think there's a little up their sleeves as well, and it's going to be very interesting to see how OPEC Plus continue with the treatment of those who have catch up to do, both in terms of having overproduced and having underproduced, and that runs through to the end of this year. In one of your comments, there was also reference to the fact that this advances by 1 month the next steps, what comes after. And it was very notable to see Alexander Novak of Russia and the OPEC Plus core members reaffirm publicly the desire to keep Russia in the club as they go forward and transition to the what next. And I'll close with Russia itself, of course. In one of your articles that you have in your pre-read, there's a reference to 600,000 barrels a day of Russian products going missing. Of course, there's an expectation in the market that that's going to increase. But we look at information available today, which of course is markets that traded 1.5 months ago. Crude output from Russia is still level pegging with what it was, and it's products that have been hit. And the considered view, I guess, is that products will continue to be hit, but harder. And that production shortfall can be made up by the OPEC Plus accelerated increase. Plus, of course, we mustn't forget that the SPR release is ongoing. So lots and lots of ingredients there. But let me just close my opening statement here. Sorry, it's so lengthy, Sean, by some comments on Asia. I mean, China, outside of China, there is a view that the demand rebound is quite something, quite extraordinary. And of course, coming back from a lower base, but a lot of the Southeast Asian countries where I'm based are very much exceeding expectations in terms of road transportation demand. And I think I said this last month already, but try buying an air ticket in Singapore summer holidays. It is awfully tough. And the airlines are going for it, as are the hotels. And that's an indication, if anything, that this pent-up demand to travel and to spend is still there. And of course, all attention now on whether that can be replicated in the lower middle classes and the working class populations, because they're spending a lot more than they would have done. I'll hold there and leave Christoph to talk about the recessionary impacts of some of this.
That's what happens when you haven't spoken for a month. Christoph Ruhl, welcome, Senior Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy, Columbia University. Welcome your thoughts on the same issues. And I'd also add, Christoph, we also had last week some fairly, big warnings from the likes of Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan. We've had warnings from Elon Musk, the richest man in the world. We've had Macron, the president of France, starting to get into a tiff with the Ukrainians. We have some big words of last week to reflect on, but welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, I won't add to the very big words, but Mike gives us, there's this soup of things, and he's right. But I always think in these times, it's good to get some structure in it. And I think we have some, I don't know if they're pleasant or not, but some sort of landscape shaping up in the topics you addressed. First, on the EU, that was a very sort of poor decision on the boycott. But in practice, it was not about just giving in to Hungary or so. It was also that they allowed the oil to be curtailed, which is shipped, which is of course the part which Russia can easily redirect. And they maintained flows through the pipeline, the Druzhba pipeline, which would have been the part which really hurt, because it's not as easily redirected from the Russian side. And what stands behind that, I think what comes increasingly out of that is that this decision making in the European Union based on unanimity is a thing which doesn't work in crisis situation and doesn't, I would argue, even work in many everyday situation. There's a stark contrast here when you look at the gas market and the oil market. In the gas market, we have individual countries deciding we're not going to deal with these ruble accounts, we're not going to follow this elaborated scheme, and then being cut off. So that's now the Netherlands, Bulgaria, Poland, and one more, I think, Lithuania. So amounting to 16% of European Union gas imports from Russia already, which are off the table in that way, in this voluntary way. And in oil, this doesn't happen. In oil, the pipeline keeps running rather than letting everybody do what he can do best. And you would have seen the Germans fixing the situation, the Druzhba pipeline at some point drying up, and then Hungary crying murder. But what could they have done other than replacing it? So this kind of unanimous decision-making just clearly showed its limits, I think. That's an important lesson, which at some point will have to be reflected into action, totally independent from the war. On the OPEC Plus decision, very similar. Remember how we used to sit and compare OPEC statements with central bank statements. Now, the fact is that they had cut output by roughly 10 million, and then back 2 years ago for the pandemic, and were supposed to bring it up. And now they are, depending whom you believed, between 2.6 and 3 million short. Now, that's a shortfall of between 26 and 30%. No central bank, no serious international institution would get away with that unscolded. They do. And it looks, so certainly as if they have to find a way out of that. And what we are seeing is walking a tightrope between peace offers with the US. Nobody wants to fall out of bed with the US in these days, and keeping Russia on board, and Russia can ill afford to be kicked out from OPEC plus. And then on the current oil market itself, I mean, we have to make a distinction. There's no shortage of crude oil. And there's a lot more ammunition for them to go both in spare capacity, where I disagree with Mike. I think there's no reason in the world to doubt the Saudi statements that they can produce up to 12.5, as they have done in surge times and as they have repeated for a long time now. And there's also more ammunition to go in the strategic petroleum reserves. There's more rig count coming on finally in the US. So crude oil doesn't seem to be the big problem at the moment, and particularly not since the Russian exports to Europe can be redirected for the time being without secondary sanctions. It's with products, in particular with diesel, that we have a problem. And there, if experience is any guide, we will see the global refining system adjusting. This is an enormously flexible system, and I have very little doubt it will do so again. So we should all expect this debate on sanctions in the oil market to continue, and also the European Union at some point to strengthen this act. And then probably the US doing a bit more saber rattling in terms of secondary sanctions again. So that becomes more confrontative, I think. That's one of the lessons here. And then the big words, I think the background is there is some, to be expected, some fatigue. Mr. Macron would like to be the peacemaker. A lot of people would like to have Ukraine and Russia just going in a back room and making a deal. And they don't understand, I think, that at least from the point of view of the Ukrainians and from those who put some value on this post-World War II order, that is sort of out of the question as long as Russia has 20% of Ukrainian territory. You don't want this kind of deal, which would just encourage bad behavior down the road. You know, in a very real sense, I think the best thing which could happen to Russia itself would be to get a real bloody nose in this war. And that becomes increasingly a minority position. I realize that, but I think
it's certainly a majority position on this roundtable. I would share that, but that's just a personal view. Mike, I wanted to get your thoughts on these two particular topics around the issue of credibility. The EU oil embargo on Russia and the OPEC plus agreement or adjustment last week. And from a market participant point of view, how much credibility you put in both of those decisions, and how much you bank on them, so to speak. Obviously, the market went up after the OPEC decision. My thesis would be that the OPEC plus credibility, our ability to influence or jawbone prices downward is negligible. Their credibility of overproducing or rather underproducing for months. They haven't met their own agreement. So how could the market really take them as credible? You could add any number on the top of the list they already had because the credibility issue. So I'm wondering your thoughts on credibility as a market influencing act, the EU credibility to impose this embargo and OPEC plus to meet this new target.
Goodness me, Sean, you used the word credibility many times there. It's very dangerous because we're talking about some highly respected individuals, politicians and protagonists in the OPEC plus club. And I mean, yes, you could say that.
Well, it's like the point, just to interrupt you, Mike, just to interrupt you generally on the Fed side, you know, there's a general narrative. The Fed has lost credibility. They're behind the curve. They're trying to catch up. They did a 25 basis point. Now they're having a conveyor belt of 50 basis points. You could say the same with OPEC plus. They've had the chance to meet their own agreement for months. They haven't done so. And now we've had a tepid little increase.
Well, I think it's just a realization that oil prices remain a little more resilient than some would have forecast, and that they are giving a little signal in response to strong requests from the Americans to keep prices under control and not add fuel to a fire where there is a concern about escalating costs to consumer and therefore the recession impact thereof. As I mentioned, I don't think the extra 216,000 barrels a day is going to make all that much difference. If you translate it, it's 3.5 VLCCs of extra production. And yes, it remains to be seen whether they actually put it out, because I think the only way they're going to be able to put out 648,000 barrels per day extra month on month is if the slack is taken up by those countries that have spare capacity. And I'll just be repeating myself, that's in the hands of Saudis and the Emiratis and really not too many others. So I think better we focus on the European side of things. They tried awfully hard, but Christoph has already answered the question. Building consensus amongst 27 nations, which needs unanimity when there are divergent priorities and economic incentives, as Hungary so nicely explained, it is awfully hard. And whilst Ursula and Charles made their best effort there, if you look at it from the perspective of the large listed majors, it doesn't change much about what they're doing. They were already self-sanctioning and not taking any Russian crude into their refining system. And this really only tightens matters around a smaller number of people that have so far been continuing to avail themselves of Russian oil. What changes, of course, is quite important, is up until now, you could buy Russian crude without any questions asked, on the assumption that you needed it in order to supply your environs around your refinery. What changes is that now you need a piece of paper that acknowledges that there was indeed a demonstrable need for it, and that's a. It might sound a little bit bureaucratic, but I think that does signal that the intent is indeed to make it a lot more difficult for European refiners. But you also touched on other things. I think Christoph referred to the shipping side of things. It's pretty important. I mean, this week happens to be the conference that takes place every 2 years in Athens, where the shipping community get together in their thousands to talk about what's happening. And I'm sure this theme will dominate matters, which is to what extent are EU registered ship owners restricted from carrying sanctioned oil, and the non-mainstream trade is going to be quite large, and the very real prospect of ships passing in the Suez Canal, one going north, one going south, both carrying more or less the same product, because you have an Asian market that is still taking Russian oil without any restrictions in certain countries, India and China, and on the other hand, that brings about surpluses or natural trade flows whereby Europe is calling for material, and this goes for just about anything, any blended products, certain crudes, and of course Europe is still sucking a lot of LNG across this way. So yeah, I don't like the word credibility, but I guess the effectiveness of these measures that are being taken is the question. And I'll come back to what I hinted at before. There is room for those OPEC members, core OPEC, that have spare capacity to make up the slack if they wish. And I think all eyes will be on whether the Saudis in particular do that. They choose to do that, because according to some, there was a little bit of undertake from the markets or under allocation in one of the recently elapsed months, and that's by rights production they could add to the market if they feel that's the right thing to do. And I think they will respond to signals. If the price continues to hold above 120 and push towards 130, they'll be more inclined to do so. As for the point you made on the problem being in products and not so much in crude, if you roll the clock 2 months forward to the periods we're trading, and in the East it's very much August now, there is a very real prospect with these margins that refineries are going flat out, cancelling turnarounds and trying to make as much product as they can. That combined with the demand loss at these higher prices, which is very real. If you switch on your TV and look at countries like Sri Lanka, there is clearly demand destruction going on, and not just there, in Africa and other places. The problem is likely to be translated from product tightness to crude tightness. And then the issue kicks in, how much demand loss is there going to be due to high prices? And again, the range of estimates there varies wildly, but if you pick 1 million barrels a day, that more or less totally offsets the incremental supply loss from Russia.
Let's just bring Christoph in on that point on demand destruction, because Christoph, there's been obviously a lot of talk about the supply side, Russia's supply, the EU embargo, and so on, and OPEC now supply increase. But ultimately, the question really is shifting towards demand and the outlook for recession and so forth. Your thoughts on where demand goes and as it's reframed, demand destruction?
Well, let me say one thing first. I think that you were completely right on credibility lost with OPEC Plus. I mean, how come we can criticize the Fed but not OPEC for completely underachieving what they said they do? And they want to, and that's important in the long term. If they want to maintain credibility, they have to decide what they announce and what they do. Leaving that aside, demand destruction is usually now captured in the discussion as a race between sort of China picking up again and the US and Europe and other advanced and emerging markets sort of falling behind in recession fears. So that's the usual picture. As far as China is concerned, so that is going to probably pick up even more, because I would maintain the position. This is the beginning of what we have been saying here for a long time, that after the lockdown and before the Communist Party Congress, there will be a boost in demand in China, will be supported by government programs, and will be concentrated on the consumption side. And that means more driving, more traveling, and more oil consumption in a very clear-cut way. So that's continuing. The recession fears are probably a little bit overblown, but we have to add two other elements to that. One is the production decline from Russia due to crude oil production, not refined products, due to damage to the fields. That's a huge, big unknowns, but as more and more voices, serious voices, the more I look into that, the structure of Russian fields is such that they have so many small wells, different from Saudi Arabia with huge wells, that when you start shutting them down, it becomes prohibitively expensive. It takes a long time to get them back up again, because the water cut increases, the small wells are not producing effectively anymore. So after the Soviet Union, it took a long time and a lot of Western investment to get them back to production, so that if there's a backlog because sanctions are actually biting, and I'm talking still crude oil here, and the Transnet system, the pipeline system getting blocked, there would be real damage to be expected from the fields, which would make for a more permanent supply cut beyond the war. And that's one thing to watch out. The other thing is something which nobody seems to have on the radar. In all these trade-offs and conflicts, there's something else. There's this food crisis going on, that everybody starts to talk right now. And there are the biofuel mandates we have. And we have to look into this more carefully, but with relaxation of the biofuel mandates, you could produce and free up a lot of the grain which is necessary to provide a food crisis. I mean, one liter of biofuel is like 7,300 calories. You could feed people for days with that. And the US, for example, has just now, is in your reading list, tightened the requirements for biofuels, requiring refineries to take more biofuels. And that will sooner or later move away from being a dirty little secret and become an issue. And that could mean that demand increases from a totally unexpected source, because biofuels are a substantial part of the input, especially in the US, which is also a grain surplus producer, and which has this political problem with the high gasoline prices. So that is something which could increase demand further from a totally unexpected corner.
Let's get the survey question in and give the rest of the room an opportunity to cast their view on this question I put, which is: OPEC Plus has lost credibility to influence oil markets lower after months of failing to achieve production targets. That's the question. It would appear the markets went up last week after their announcement. It tells its own story, I suppose. But Mike, I wanted to come back on your point there, and I think it's that nexus between economic pent-up demand versus complete meltdown, right? Sri Lanka versus Singapore. The outlook in Asia, we've got Nepal on the borderline of bankruptcy. We've got Pakistan below 10 billion of foreign reserves and heading towards what many analysts are forecasting not too far behind Sri Lanka. And yet you have this outlook, as you articulate, of pent-up mobility in Asia. I'm just wondering where you see those two universes, the consequence of these literally sovereign bankruptcies in Sri Lanka's case and others to follow.
Sure, the audio is a bit off, but yes, I think you've already articulated it quite well. I mean, the divide between the prosperous and the countries that have lower ability to pay for commodities across the spectrum is becoming extremely stark, and people in the let's call it first world perhaps unwittingly passing the problems on to those that do not have the have-nots. And yes, the credit challenges around supplying certain countries that you mentioned there are extreme, and they fall very much under the remit of what I do here. We have tenders that we're facing into these countries where the government is getting actively involved in pleading with creditors to help them keep the country supplied, because we see the consequences of what happened. There was I think a tear gas canister that went into the belly of a Sri Lankan chap that was trying to obtain fuel, and the poor chap died. I mean, this is not pleasant reading, and there tends to be a correlation between social unrest and shortages of fuel, when of course countries like Sri Lanka have to secure food and pharmaceuticals ahead of all that. So yes, the world has to take note of the fact that this is becoming a problem. And of course for us, people monitoring supply and demand, it's something that hits demand very, very graphically. You mentioned Pakistan, of course, a huge economy with political challenges, transition government in place, and as you say, with reserves running low also. So it hits demand, and unfortunately, from the perspective of those in our market that sit in places like Singapore, a lot of distraction coming from China, and indeed the purchasing power in other parts of Asia, causing them to worry about their holidays and spending 3 times more on their air tickets, and what that means in terms of demand. We're seeing record numbers going through at the pumps in Malaysia, for example, post Ramadan, and it looks like some of these economies are very much still in catch-up mode. So yes, a tale of two worlds, and very sadly, the problems that emanate from the Russia-Ukraine crisis are being passed on by countries, even Japan, that put in place a fuel subsidy, believe it or not, a couple of months back, unwittingly, I guess, to the less payment-worthy countries. Sean, I don't think we've been completed. We didn't talk about Iran a little bit, if I may. I mean,
sure.
You have to take a view that the status quo is this, right? The US is allowing a certain amount of flows under carve-out, which they've given the sort of sound okay to, namely flows to China. And at the same time, there's also a certain amount of Venezuelan flow that is condoned. But it would appear like if we assume the JCPOA is more or less hacked out, then it's a political decision centering around the refusal of the Americans to accede to the request to drop the designation of the Republican Guard as a terror organization. This is a sticking point that's likely to persist. And I think most analysts now don't have any Iranian oil coming back this year, but it is another form of release in terms of oil ready to go now because of so much being in storage and floating. 100 and something million barrels, take your pick, regarding where the condensate is. Now, I think the window of political opportunity for the Biden administration to reach a deal with Iran is already evaporating, if not gone, because they're getting into midterms soon. But if the midterms are dominated by needing to keep gas prices low in America, turning a somewhat greater blind eye to these sanctioned barrels flowing out and competing with Russian for that matter, is probably something that you might expect to see. And the US intervention in these flows has always been pretty sparse anyway. So whilst I don't think there's going to be a deal, I think the clamping down and arresting of ships, even though there was some going on in the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean just recently, and then a reciprocal arrest of ships in the Hormuz area, I think there's a chance that Uncle Sam might just allow a little bit more of that oil to flow, which is not good for markets because it creates a three-tier market, if you like, right?
Well, by just on that point, if you've got those two pieces, right, you've got the Iranian leak, and now you've got these heavily discounted Russian barrels coming into Asia, coming into China, and looking to increase. How should the Saudis and the Gulf Arabs look at that? Is that a threat to their market? Is it no big deal over the midterm?
This is where this huge range of views comes in. I mean, if you believe that things are going to remain pretty tight and there's not enough oil to go around because of spare capacity concerns and the whole underinvestment theme, then those consultants and those experts believe that we need those Iranian surpluses to come to the market because there's nowhere else to bring it from. If you believe that the Saudis have an extra 1 million barrels of spare capacity and that there's going to be substantial demand destruction because of recessionary concerns and high commodity prices, then you don't. So take a pick on that spectrum. I think that.
But it's not binary, no?
Yeah.
Let's give Christoph the last word here on these different issues. Christoph, just survey question first, if you don't mind. Okay, 50-50. There you go. Christoph, your thoughts on some of those points as you wrap up?
Well, again, I think there is no problem with crude at the moment. I've been saying this for months, and this is not binary, Iran versus OPEC Plus. We have 4 safety valves. We have the SPR, we have Venezuela, Iran, and add to that Nigeria and Libya, where a little bit of relaxation and peace bringing would increase output. We have the core OPEC countries in their spare capacity, and we have shale, which we haven't talked about, ratcheting up if the US really seriously pivots. And then on the other things, I think what we have to watch next week is also whether the situation in the Ukraine turns into a stalemate or not. Because the Ukraine is set to get the heavy guns. They say they need to respond in kind to the concentration of Russian efforts in the Donetsk basin. And if they can repel them there and in the south, then this will remain a liquid, a fluid situation. If not, then we go into this war, which like the First World War, can drag on for a very long time. And on the global picture, the most important for oil markets will, I think, be China. whether they will need additional measures or whether they can sort of turn the economy around. In both cases, it will be good for oil markets, not for oil demand. And the question is how high it will get. And on the more narrowly situation here in the Middle East, so I don't think anybody needs to be afraid of oil prices plunging, but I do think we will see the sanction games continue precisely because there is more scope in the crude oil markets to tighten the screws. And people who are adamant about one way or another ending that war would continue to advocate for tightening the screws on sanctions, including those in government.
Mike, just to wrap up on the question of, do you identify anything that is other in the immediate sense that stops oil prices from incrementally squeezing higher? I mean, everything seems to be pointing towards a higher market, other than demand destruction in the midterm. But
I thought you gave Christoph the final word. Okay.
No, but I just remembered I wanted to get your definitive position on that direction of travel. I mean, you did mention the word earlier in your first comment, I think, that the China recovery was substantial, or some fairly, big adverb there, but the recovery in China demand-wise would indicate every element of the price is upward.
What I was referring to was people coming out of their houses and creating local traffic jams after midnight on the day they were allowed out. So no, I think we need to remain cautious, and let's not underestimate the volume of barrels coming out of SPRs still hitting markets now. And you can see it manifesting itself in shipping rates for dirty freight. Those markets have not really gone anywhere, despite the fact that you have the sanctions causing oil to move from west to east and all that. So I think I don't think the markets are overheating, but I do think the range of expert opinions out there has never been wider. There are people who think the market's going to 135, 140, and there are also people who think we're going below 100 again. And how that plays out is very much a function of demand and the impact of these higher prices on demand. And whilst I think that the affluent world is going to have their holidays and burn jet fuel and cause airlines to schedule flights, Singapore Airlines apparently recruited 2,500 flight attendants last week, which they need to do, I can tell you, because I can't get tickets. But the impact elsewhere is a lot more profound. And for the more challenged middle classes that have higher energy, higher food bills, this year's holiday is fine. But I think the Christmas ski holiday and next year's vacation next summer might be an economic pinch. So I think that's just my way of illustrating that we have a couple of hard breaks on this thing, which it's hard to say what it means for oil price, but I don't think we're off to the races as you suggest, Sean.
Christoph, on that point, another final point is that Mike is sort of indicating there that there's a somewhat agnostic inflation, that people are absorbing this inflation and continuing to spend, that it will be very difficult to derail that demand.
Well, if you're asking about the impact of oil prices on inflation, and there is a reason for the central banks of this world to tend to take oil and food price increases away, because they are so volatile and they're acting in both directions immediately at the moment they occur. So they are not usually constant drivers of inflation. But I think you asked the other way around. And then inflation for oil is only a problem once it hits demand, and it hits demand only once it hits economic growth. So the single most important thing, and here I agree completely with Mike, is what we call aggregate economic growth, the sum of all these components of recession fears, China recovering, and if inflation impacts economic growth, it will do so through creating a recession or a slowdown in particular countries. Then it becomes a matter for oil demand, and then it becomes a matter for oil prices. Inflation per se can jump up and down and will be absorbed in oil price increases up and down, not reflected in any real changes. That's possible, and that has happened before. Will there be a global recession with a real hard impact on oil demand? I think under current constellations, no, but there will be a lot of victims on the sidelines, in particular in emerging market economies. We will see more bankruptcies there.
Definitely, with rates rising at the speed they will, dollar-denominated debt across Asia is going to be a squeeze. We're going to have to wrap it up. Maybe we need to move this once a month session to an hour and not 30 minutes. Mike Muller sitting in the delightful sunshine of Asia, Singapore. Are you, Mike? I didn't get that at the beginning, but
Athens.
Sorry, excuse me, Athens. Well, there's a bit of nice sunshine. And Christoph sitting in Germany. Thank you guys both very, very much. Have a great day, a great Sunday. We'll catch up with everybody through the week, 10:30 UAE time. All the best. Christoph, Mike, look forward to seeing you guys soon. All the best.
Take care.